The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle as 8-year-old Princess Charlotte walked beside her grandmother, Queen Consort Camilla. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and the distant sound of changing guards. Charlotte's small hand clutched a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked from the castle gardens, intending to place them at the memorial statue of her great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II. Sergeant James Mitchell stood at his post near the east terrace, his bearskin cap perfectly aligned, his scarlet tunic immaculate. 23 years of service had taught him to read situations before they unfolded, to sense tension in the air like a change in weather. Today, something felt different. The Queen Consort's stride was more purposeful than usual, her jaw set with determination that spelled trouble. Charlotte skipped alongside, her navy blue coat bouncing with each step, completely unaware of the storm brewing in her grandmother's mind. The young princess had always been spirited, much like her mother, Catherine, but with a streak of independence that sometimes challenged royal protocol. Today would be no exception. As they approached the memorial garden, other visitors respectfully stepped aside, some curtsying, others bowing their heads. Mitchell observed from his position, noting how Camilla's eyes narrowed when Charlotte broke away from her side, running ahead toward the statue. The Queen Consort's lips pressed into a thin line, an expression Mitchell had seen before when younger royals forgot their place. "Charlotte, come back here immediately," Camilla's voice cut through the morning air, sharp enough to make several tourists turn their heads. The command carried the weight of decades of royal protocol, of expectations that children should be seen and not heard, should walk and not run, should obey without question. But Charlotte, in her childish enthusiasm, continued forward, her flowers held high as she approached the memorial. She hadn't heard, or perhaps had chosen not to hear, lost in her own world of remembrance for the great-grandmother she had loved so dearly. Mitchell watched as Camilla's face flushed with indignation. The Queen Consort quickened her pace, her heels clicking against the stone with increasing tempo. He could see the tension building in her shoulders, the way her gloved hands clenched and unclenched. Years of experience told him this was heading toward a confrontation that would require delicate handling. Other guards stationed around the memorial garden had also noticed the developing situation. Private Thomas Clark, positioned near the garden entrance, straightened imperceptibly. Lance Corporal Sarah Bennett, standing by the north wall, shifted her weight slightly, ready to respond if needed. They all knew the protocols, but they also knew that situations involving the younger royals required a special kind of diplomacy. Charlotte had reached the memorial now, carefully placing her wildflowers at the base of the statue. She stood there for a moment, her small figure dwarfed by the bronze memorial, her head bowed in a gesture that would have melted any heart. But Camilla was beyond being moved by the touching scene. Her authority had been challenged, and in her mind, that could not stand. "When I give you an instruction, you follow it immediately." Camilla's voice rose as she reached Charlotte, causing several visitors to step further back, sensing the awkwardness of witnessing a royal disciplinary moment. "You do not run ahead. You do not ignore me. You are a princess, and you will behave as one." Charlotte turned, her blue eyes wide with confusion. She had only wanted to honor her great-grandmother. In her young mind, she couldn't understand why something so simple, so heartfelt, could cause such anger. Her lower lip trembled slightly, but she held her ground, a trait she had inherited from her father, Prince William. Mitchell observed the interaction closely. He had seen Charlotte grow from a toddler to the confident young girl she was now. He had also witnessed Camilla's struggles to establish her authority within the family, especially with the younger generation who had known no other grandmother figure but the late Queen Elizabeth II. This clash had been building for months, small incidents piling upon each other, like kindling waiting for a spark. The garden had fallen silent except for the distant sound of traffic beyond the castle walls. Even the birds seemed to have paused their morning songs. Tourists stood frozen, some with cameras half raised, unsure whether to document this unprecedented moment or respect the family's privacy. The tension was palpable, hanging in the air like morning mist. Camilla reached for Charlotte's arm, intending to guide her forcefully back to the prescribed path, to restore order to what she perceived as chaos. It was then that Charlotte did something unexpected. something that would change everything in the next 37 seconds. She stepped back, avoiding her grandmother's reach, and spoke with a clarity that belied her 8 years. Great-granny wouldn't have minded, Charlotte said, her voice small but steady. She loved wildflowers. She told me so. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Mitchell saw Camilla's face transform from indignation to something harder, more dangerous. The queen consort was not accustomed to being contradicted, especially not by a child. And especially not in public. Her position, still relatively new and sometimes precarious, felt threatened by this small act of defiance. "How dare you?" Camilla began, her voice low and threatening. She took another step toward Charlotte, her intention clear. She would physically remove the child from the memorial. Protocol, be damned. The watching crowd held its collective breath. This was unprecedented. A senior royal about to forcefully discipline a young princess in full public view. Mitchell knew the moment had come. His duty was clear, though the path to fulfilling it was fraught with political and personal landmines. The royal guard's primary responsibility was to protect members of the royal family. But that protection extended beyond physical threats. Sometimes, it meant protecting them from themselves, from moments that could damage the monarchy's carefully cultivated image. He began to move, each step measured and deliberate. His fellow guards noticed immediately, reading his intent in his posture. This was not a security threat in the traditional sense, but it was a threat nonetheless, to the dignity of the crown, to the well-being of a young princess, and to the delicate balance of power within the royal family. As Mitchell approached, he caught Charlotte's eye. The young princess looked at him with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. She recognized him. Of course, he had been a fixture in her life since she was old enough to remember. A silent, reassuring presence at countless royal events. Now, she seemed to sense that he might be her ally in this moment of crisis. Camilla, focused entirely on Charlotte, hadn't noticed Mitchell's approach. Her hand was outstretched, about to grasp Charlotte's shoulder. When Mitchell spoke, his voice was calm, professional, but carried an undertone of authority that came from years of service and an intimate understanding of his duty. "Your Majesty," he said, the words cutting through the tension like a sword through silk. Camilla froze, her hand suspended in midair. She turned slowly to face Mitchell, her expression a mixture of surprise and indignation. How dare a guard interrupt her? How dare he insert himself into a family matter? But Mitchell stood firm, his posture perfect, his expression neutral but resolved. The next 37 seconds would become the most talked-about moment in recent royal history. They would be analyzed, dissected, and debated in parlors and pubs across the nation. They would test loyalties, challenge protocols, and ultimately redefine the boundaries of duty and protection within the royal guard. Mitchell had made his choice. Now, he would have to live with the consequences. The clock was ticking, and every second counted. The watching crowd, the fellow guards, Charlotte, and Camilla all waited to see what would happen next. The morning sun continued to rise, casting new shadows across the memorial garden, as if nature itself was marking this pivotal moment in royal history. Sergeant James Mitchell stood perfectly still, his eyes locked with Queen Consort Camilla's. In that frozen moment, years of training battled with human instinct. The first second ticked by as Camilla's expression shifted from surprise to incredulity. No guard had ever dared interrupt her in such a manner. Her hand remained suspended in the air, inches from Charlotte's shoulder, as if time itself had paused. "Your Majesty," Mitchell repeated, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "Perhaps Princess Charlotte might be more comfortable if we maintained the scheduled protocol for the memorial visit." The words were carefully chosen, diplomatic yet firm, offering Camilla a graceful exit from the escalating situation. By the 5th second, Camilla's face had transformed into a mask of cold fury. Her eyes, usually carefully controlled in public, now blazed with an intensity that would have sent most people scrambling for cover. But Mitchell held his ground, his body positioned subtly but deliberately between the queen consort and the young princess. Charlotte, wise beyond her years, remained still. instinctively understanding that movement might shatter whatever protection Mitchell's intervention had provided. Her small hand found the edge of his ceremonial tunic. Not quite touching, but close enough to feel safer. The gesture was so slight that only Mitchell noticed it. But it strengthened his resolve. "Sergeant," Camilla's voice dripped with ice as the 10th second passed. "You forget yourself. This is a family matter." Mitchell's fellow guards watched with mounting tension. Private Clark's hand had unconsciously moved closer to his ceremonial sword. Not as a threat, but as an anchor in this unprecedented situation. Lance Corporal Bennett had taken a strategic position where she could observe both the confrontation and the growing crowd of onlookers, many of whom now had their phones discreetly raised. "With respect, Your Majesty," Mitchell continued, knowing each word could end his career. "My duty is to ensure the safety and well-being of all members of the royal family." He paused, letting the implications sink in. The safety he spoke of wasn't just physical. It was the safety of reputation, of dignity, of a young child's emotional well-being. 15 seconds had elapsed when Camilla took a step forward, her intention clear. She would go through Mitchell if necessary, but the sergeant, reading her movement, shifted slightly, maintaining his position. It wasn't aggressive, merely protective. But the message was unmistakable. He would not be moved. The watching tourists were mesmerized. Some had lowered their phones, recognizing the gravity of what they were witnessing. Others continued recording, knowing they were capturing history. A small child in the crowd began to cry, sensing the tension, and was quickly hushed by her mother. At 20 seconds, Charlotte spoke, her young voice cutting through the standoff like sunlight through storm clouds. "I'm sorry, Granny Camilla," she said, using the familiar term that seemed to physically pain Camilla in this formal setting. "I didn't mean to upset you. I just wanted to show Great Granny my flowers." The innocence in her voice, the genuine confusion about why her simple act of love had caused such anger, seemed to affect everyone present except Camilla. Mitchell saw several tourists dabbing at their eyes. Even Private Clark's rigid expression softened momentarily. But Camilla was beyond being moved. 25 seconds in, she made her decision. "Stand aside, Sergeant," she commanded, her voice carrying the full weight of her position. "That is a direct order from your queen consort." This was the moment Mitchell had dreaded. To disobey a direct royal command went against everything he had sworn to uphold. Yet his duty to protect Charlotte, not just as a princess but as a child, warred with his obligation to obey. In that split second, he thought of his own daughter, roughly Charlotte's age, and imagined her in this situation. "Your Majesty," Mitchell responded at the 30-second mark, his voice carrying a strength born of absolute conviction. "I must respectfully decline. The princess has done nothing wrong, and I cannot in good conscience stand aside while she is subjected to what appears to be disproportionate correction." 1. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Several guards audibly gasped. A direct refusal of a royal command. It was unprecedented in modern times. Camilla's face went white, then red, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to process this unthinkable defiance. At 35 seconds, Charlotte moved. With the innate grace that seemed to run in the Windsor women, she stepped out from behind Mitchell and faced her grandmother directly. "I'll come with you now, Granny," she said quietly. "We can walk together properly. I understand." It was a moment of maturity that should have diffused the situation. But Camilla was too far gone in her rage. She lunged forward, attempting to grab Charlotte's arm roughly, her control finally snapping completely. But Mitchell was faster. In one smooth motion, he stepped between them again, this time actively blocking Camilla's path. 37 seconds. "No, Your Majesty," Mitchell said firmly. "I cannot allow that." The silence that followed was deafening. Camilla stood frozen, her face a study in disbelief and fury. Charlotte pressed close to Mitchell's back, seeking protection. The other guards remained at their posts, but their attention was entirely focused on the unprecedented scene before them. Tourists stood in shocked silence, many still recording, others simply staring in disbelief. The ramifications of those 37 seconds rippled outward like waves from a stone thrown into still water. Within minutes, the first social media posts would appear. Within an hour, news outlets would pick up the story. By evening, the footage would be played and replayed on every major news channel, analyzed by body language experts, royal correspondents, and child psychologists. But in that moment, as the 37th second ticked over to 38, the immediate concern was what would happen next. Camilla's authority had been challenged in the most public way possible. Mitchell had crossed a line that many believed should never be crossed. And Charlotte, young Princess Charlotte, had become the center of a constitutional crisis she couldn't possibly understand. The head of royal security, Colonel Edmund Fitzgerald, had been alerted the moment Mitchell first intervened. He was now making his way quickly but discreetly toward the memorial garden, his mind racing through protocols and precedents, finding none that quite fit this situation. His arrival would mark the beginning of the formal aftermath. But for now, the three figures remained locked in their tableau. Mitchell maintained his protective stance, knowing his career hung by a thread but certain he had made the right choice. Camilla struggled with her rage and humiliation, her carefully constructed image as the dignified queen consort crumbling before hundreds of eyes. And Charlotte, brave little Charlotte, stood tall despite her fear, embodying a quiet dignity that reminded many observers of her late great-grandmother. The 37 seconds were over, but their impact would resonate for years to come. The Royal Guard's motto, Dieu est mon droit, God and my right, had taken on new meaning. Mitchell had claimed a higher duty than blind obedience, a moral right that superseded protocol. Whether history would vindicate him remained to be seen. As the 38th second began, Camilla finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the still air. "You will regret this, Sergeant. I promise you that." Mitchell's response was calm, professional, and carried a weight that surprised even him. "Perhaps, Your Majesty, but I would regret allowing harm to come to Princess Charlotte far more." The words marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The Royal Guard had always been seen as silent, obedient protectors. Mitchell had proven they could be something more. Guardians not just of physical safety, but of dignity, childhood, and what was right. The consequences would be severe. But in that moment, with Charlotte safe behind him, Mitchell knew he could face whatever came next. The morning sun climbed higher, its rays now illuminating the memorial garden fully. The statue of Queen Elizabeth II seemed to watch over the scene with benevolent eyes, as if the late monarch herself approved of this protection of her beloved great-granddaughter. The wildflowers Charlotte had placed at its base remained undisturbed, a splash of innocent color in a morning that had turned dark with adult conflicts and power struggles. The aftermath of those 37 seconds unfolded like a carefully choreographed disaster. Colonel Edmund Fitzgerald arrived at the memorial garden exactly 3 minutes after Mitchell's defiance, his measured stride betraying none of the turmoil churning beneath his composed exterior. He had served the royal family for 32 years, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for this. "Your Majesty," Fitzgerald bowed deeply to Camilla, then turned to acknowledge Charlotte with a gentler nod. "Princess, Sergeant Mitchell." His voice carried the authority of his position, but also a careful neutrality that had been honed through decades of navigating royal conflicts. Camilla's composure had partially returned, though her hands still trembled with suppressed rage. "Colonel, I want this man removed from duty immediately. He has committed an act of gross insubordination that cannot be tolerated." Charlotte, still standing close to Mitchell, looked up at the colonel with those expressive blue eyes that had already captured the nation's heart. "Colonel Fitzgerald, Sergeant Mitchell was only trying to help. I don't want him to get in trouble because of me." The colonel's expression softened almost imperceptibly. He had watched Charlotte grow up, had been present at countless family gatherings, and knew the special place she held in the nation's affections. He also knew that the videos of this incident were likely already spreading across the internet like wildfire. "Perhaps," Fitzgerald suggested carefully, "we might continue this discussion in a more private setting. The memorial garden is rather exposed for such conversations." It was a masterful move. offering everyone an escape from the public eye while maintaining dignity. But Camilla was having none of it. Her position as queen consort, still relatively new and sometimes questioned by those loyal to the memory of Diana and respectful of Catherine's future role, felt threatened by this very public challenge. "There is nothing to discuss," Camilla stated coldly. The sergeant refused a direct order. "The consequences are clear," Mitchell finally spoke, his voice calm despite knowing he was likely ending a career he had devoted his adult life to building. "Colonel, I acted according to my understanding of our deeper duty, to protect all members of the royal family, even from each other when necessary. I submit myself to whatever inquiry you deem appropriate." The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, drawn by the unmistakable tension and the unusual sight of royal guards out of their traditional stoic positions. Social media was already ablaze with hashtags. Number Sergeant Mitchell. Number Protect Charlotte. Number Royal Guardian. The first news vans were pulling up outside the castle gates. Prince William had been in a meeting with conservation groups when his private secretary burst in with an urgent message. The color drained from his face as he watched the video on the secretary's phone. His daughter, his precious Charlotte, at the center of a public confrontation with Camilla. And a guard. Brave, honorable Sergeant Mitchell, standing as her protector. "Clear my schedule," William commanded, already moving toward the door. "And get me the head of royal security on the phone." Now, Catherine, Princess of Wales, was at a children's hospital when the news reached her. She maintained her composure through the remaining 10 minutes of her visit, but those who knew her well could see the steel in her spine, the protective mother bear awakening. The moment she was in the privacy of her car, she called William. "I've seen it," she said without preamble. "Is Charlotte all right?" "She's safe." Mitchell protected her. William's voice carried a mixture of relief and rage. "I'm heading there now." "William," Catherine's tone was warning. "Remember, the world is watching. Whatever we do next will define not just this moment, but Charlotte's relationship with the institution for years to come." Back at the Memorial Garden, Colonel Fitzgerald had managed to create a small bubble of space around the key players, using his guards to form a discreet barrier between them and the growing crowd. But the damage was done. The videos were everywhere, and public opinion was forming rapidly and decisively. Mitchell stood at attention, every inch the professional soldier despite the turmoil around him. He had made his choice with full knowledge of the consequences. What he hadn't expected was Charlotte's small hand slipping into his. A gesture of solidarity that would become one of the most shared images of the decade. "Sergeant Mitchell is my friend," Charlotte announced, her young voice carrying surprising authority. "He's always protected our family. That's what guards do, isn't it?" "Colonel?" Fitzgerald found himself in an impossible position. Protocol demanded Mitchell be disciplined for disobeying a direct royal command, but public sentiment, already largely sympathetic to the young princess and skeptical of Camilla's position, would explode if Mitchell was punished for protecting a child. King Charles had been informed of the situation while visiting a renewable energy facility in Scotland. His reaction, according to those present, was one of weary resignation. The delicate balance he had tried to maintain between his wife and his grandchildren had finally shattered in the most public way possible. "Arrange for my immediate return to London," he instructed his secretary. Then, more quietly, "and ensure that Charlotte is with her parents, not anyone else." The implications of those 37 seconds continued to ripple outward. Royal correspondents interrupted regular programming with breaking news updates. Social media influencers dissected every frame of the available footage. Child psychologists were interviewed about the potential impact on Charlotte. Constitutional experts debated the role of the Royal Guard and the limits of royal authority. At Kensington Palace, William and Catherine had reunited with Charlotte, who seemed remarkably composed for a child who had just been at the center of such drama. She sat between her parents, still clutching the extra wildflower she had kept from her bouquet. "I just wanted to give Great-Granny flowers," she said softly. "Like Mummy taught me. To show we remember people we love." William's jaw clenched. His mother, Diana, had taught him the same thing. That small gestures of love and remembrance mattered more than rigid protocol. That humanity should never be sacrificed on the altar of tradition. It was a lesson Camilla seemed to have forgotten, if she ever knew it at all. The palace's communication team was in crisis mode. Traditional damage control wouldn't work here. The footage was too clear, the public sentiment too strong. Moreover, internal sources were already leaking details about long-standing tensions between Camilla and the younger royals, particularly her struggles to assert authority over William and Catherine's children. By evening, Sergeant James Mitchell had become a household name. His service record was exemplary. Tours in Afghanistan, commendations for bravery, a spotless disciplinary record, until this moment. Veterans groups rallied to his support. Parents praised him for protecting a child. The hashtag number Knight Sergeant Mitchell began trending, with hundreds of thousands calling for him to be honored, not punished. In her private apartments, Camilla sat in stony silence, watching the news coverage with growing dismay. Every commentator seemed to side with Mitchell and Charlotte. Her attempt to assert authority had backfired spectacularly, undermining the very position she had sought to strengthen. The comparison to Queen Elizabeth II's gentle way with her great-grandchildren was inevitable and unflattering. The Prime Minister, sensing the public mood, made a carefully worded statement supporting the protection of all members of the royal family, especially children, and praising the dedication of our service members who must sometimes make difficult decisions in the line of duty. It was a clear signal of where political support would fall. As night descended over London, an emergency meeting was convened at Buckingham Palace. Present were King Charles, Prince William, Princess Catherine, and senior palace officials. Notably absent was Camilla, who had been advised by Charles to rest after the morning's events. Also absent, but very much the subject of discussion, was Sergeant Mitchell, who waited in an anteroom, his fate hanging in the balance. The public won't stand for him being punished, the palace's chief communications officer stated bluntly. The optics are terrible. A guard protects a child from harsh treatment and gets fired? It would be a public relations disaster of epic proportions. William leaned forward, his expression intense. It's not about public relations. It's about right and wrong. Mitchell did the right thing. He protected my daughter when she needed protection. That should be commended, not punished. Charles, looking every one of his years, nodded slowly. The question is how we move forward. The authority of the crown has been challenged. But perhaps it needed to be. Perhaps we've forgotten that authority without compassion is merely tyranny. The meeting continued long into the night, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Public opinion, combined with William's fierce advocacy and Charles's growing recognition that the old ways needed updating, sealed Mitchell's fate. Though not in the way Camilla had demanded. The next morning, an unprecedented announcement was made. Sergeant James Mitchell was to be commended for exceptional judgment in protecting the welfare of a member of the royal family. Furthermore, new guidelines would be established for the Royal Guard, explicitly acknowledging their duty to protect the physical and emotional well-being of all royals, especially children. Charlotte was allowed to return to the memorial garden, this time accompanied by both her parents. She placed fresh flowers at her great-grandmother's statue, and this time, no one questioned her right to do so in her own way, at her own pace. Sergeant Mitchell was there too, back at his post, wearing a new commendation on his uniform. As Charlotte passed him, she paused and looked up at the sergeant who had risked everything to protect her. "Thank you," she said simply, but her smile said much more. Mitchell maintained his professional bearing, but those watching closely might have seen the slightest nod of acknowledgement. He had faced down a queen consort, risked his career, and challenged centuries of protocol. And he would do it again in a heartbeat. The 37 seconds that had shattered Camilla's authority had also revealed something fundamental about the modern monarchy. It could no longer rely solely on tradition and hierarchy. It needed humanity, compassion, and the courage to protect the vulnerable, even from within its own ranks. Camilla's position as queen consort remained, but her authority over the younger royals was effectively ended. She would appear at state functions, fulfill her ceremonial duties, but the real future of the monarchy lay with William, Catherine, and their children, protected by guards who understood that true loyalty sometimes means standing up to power, not just for it. Years later, when Princess Charlotte was asked about that day in an interview, she would say, "Sergeant Mitchell taught me something important, that doing the right thing isn't always the same as doing what you're told. Sometimes protecting someone is the highest form of service." And somewhere in London, a retired royal guard would watch that interview with a quiet smile, knowing that those 37 seconds of defiance had been worth every consequence. He had protected a princess, preserved a childhood, and perhaps helped save the monarchy from its own worst impulses. Not bad for a morning's work.